Now that we've stitched the shell and lining separately, we can move on to the next step. In this lesson, we show how to join the lining and shell, as well as how to construct the hem and vents of the jacket. We start by going into prepare mode. The shell and the lining will be joined at the hem, vents, and neckline. We marquee select the shell patterns and enable Use in 3D. Let's join the neckline first. For this, we stitch the necklines together. This includes the top portion of the lapel edges. As mentioned in the previous lesson, the hem of the jacket is constructed in this manner. The blazer has a grown-on facing on the shell patterns with a total width of 1.5 centimeters. The grown-on facing is folded up and is stitched to the lining that folds up by 0.5 centimeters to retain movement of the lining. This fold on the lining prevents the lining from pulling on the inside of the garment. There are already markings on the shell and lining patterns on where they need to be folded up. For this, we have two options. The first method is to fold up the hem of the patterns as per the original construction. The second method is to slice off the facing of the garment, flip the patterns, and stitch as a separate pattern. The second option is great if it's difficult controlling the simulation of the garment and when there are too many layers to work with. Once again, the level of detailing depends on what you want to achieve with the jacket. For this example, we show how to fold up the hem. To fold up the patterns, we need to add internal lines to fold. For the shell, they need to be folded up 1.5 centimeters, so we multi-select the hem of the shell patterns and do a clone by offset of -1.5 centimeters. We select Extend to Edges and click Apply. For the lining, the hem needs to be folded up 0.5 centimeters, so we multi-select the lining edges and do a clone by offset of -0.5 centimeters. We select Extend to Edges and click Apply. Let's fold up the lining first. We multi-select the internal lines, then go to the Context view under Line Properties and select the Fold property. If needed, we can flip the fold direction for the pieces that are not folding correctly. The hem of the lining should be folding away from the bodice. Let's adjust the fold to sharp. Now we fold the shell pattern. And we fold along the added internal lines. Next, we adjust the fold direction if needed. We change the fold to a sharp fold. The pattern should be folding in towards the lining, so we need to adjust the prepare angle to -170 degrees. You can pause the video here and complete folding up the lining and shell hem facing before moving on to the next part. Now we are going to start constructing the back vent. First, we move the shell and lining patterns closer together to make it easier to stitch. Refer to this diagram of the inside of the garment to have a better understanding about how we construct the back vent. The yellow parts are the lining, and the green parts are the shell and the folded up grown-on facing of the shell patterns. For the wearer's left side of the vent, the shell's grown-on facing is folded inwards and stitched to the left lining. The part folded in is stitched to the folded up hem facing of the shell. The lining is folded by 0.5 centimeters and stitched to the shell's grown-on hem facing, which is folded up, forming a mitered corner. The wearer's right shell and right lining are stitched along these edges. The lining is folded in by 0.5 centimeters and stitched to the shell's grown-on hem facing, which is folded up. Lastly, the right and left side of the lining and the shell patterns are joined along this edge. Let's go back to V-Stitcher. We start with the wearer's left shell pattern. We need to fold along this internal line. We always check the fold in the 3D window. We simply invert the fold direction if needed. Next, we change the fold to a sharp fold. It is also important to note that if we have more than one fold line on a pattern, we must ensure that they do not cross one another at any point, as this can cause simulation issues. If the lines overlap one another, we need to adjust them. The flap needs to fold inwards, so we change the prepare angle to -170 degrees. This pattern needs to be overlapping the wearer's right side, so we need to adjust the pattern's 3D layer to be higher. Let's change the layer to layer 4. Now we need to stitch the left shell to the left lining pattern. We stitch this edge we have folded to the lining. For this edge, since the facing is folded in, we need to flip the stitch direction like this. Then we stitch these two edges together. Stitching these two edges forms the mitered corner of the facing, as seen on an earlier diagram. We leave the hem stitching out for now. Next, we stitch the right side. We stitch these two edges. The stitch lengths don't match, and there should be a 1.5 centimeter extra length on the edge for the folded up shell pattern to be stitched to, so we need to ensure that the stitches match. Then we stitch the 1.5 centimeter facing to this edge. Match and adjust the position like this. We stitch this edge of the shell to this edge of the lining. Lastly, we need to stitch the two sides of the vent together. We do so by stitching the lining together along this edge. We move the patterns to their previous positions in the 2D window. You can pause the video here and complete stitching the vent on the back. We apply the same concept to the vent on the sleeves, but first, let's have a closer look at the diagram of the inside view of the sleeve opening. The sleeve vent is the same as the back vent, except that the top sleeve grown on facing is extended and longer than the bottom sleeve. This means that when joining the top sleeve to the bottom sleeve, we need to be careful to adjust the stitch lengths. We move the sleeve patterns closer to one another on the 2D window. We then position the patterns like this for a better view of the vent closing. We first fold the sleeve along this internal line on the top sleeve. And we adjust the fold to be sharp, with a negative fold angle. Next, we stitch these edges on the top sleeve shell to these edges on the top sleeve lining. For these edges, we adjust the stitch length on the lining to match. Next, we stitch these two edges together on the top sleeve shell to create the mitered corner on the facing. Now on to the bottom sleeve. We stitch this edge of the shell to this edge of the lining. Similar to the back vent, there should be 1.5 centimeter allowance for the folded up hem facing to be stitched to. Then we stitch the folded up hem facing and adjust the stitches to match. We join this edge of the shell to the lining and ensure that the stitch is not flipped. Lastly, on the lining, we stitch the top edge of the flaps together and adjust the stitch length to match so as to join the top sleeve to the bottom sleeve. Now, we move the patterns back to their previous positions in the 2D window. The top sleeve of the shell will be overlapping the bottom sleeve, so we adjust the top sleeve to be a layer higher. You can pause the video here to complete stitching the vents on the sleeves. Once we are done with the vents, we can start stitching the hem of the lining patterns to the hem of the shell patterns. Here's a tip. Disable internal elements to avoid making mistakes when stitching. As you are stitching, be sure to check that the stitches are not flipped. The last step is to stitch the facing to the main shell. We remove any additional corner points on the shell patterns before stitching. The lining is folded up by 0.5 centimeters and stitched to the shell facing. This leaves a 1 centimeter gap at the bottom, since the lining will overlap the shell's facing. The lining and the shell are then stitched to the facing pattern. In some blazer designs, the lining's fold is lowered to half its height and leveled with the facing. Thus, it's always important to analyze the patterns and understand how the garment is constructed first before stitching in 3D. We want to stitch the folded facing of the lining and the shell pattern first. At the bottom of the facing pattern, we can remove this corner point. Note that there are markings for where the folded up hem facing is to be stitched to the lapel facing pattern. Then we stitch these two edges together and adjust the stitch length to match. We need to flip the stitch direction, since otherwise the flap on the shell would be folded up. Now we stitch the lining's hem facing to the lapel facing. Since that portion of the lining is folded up, we need to make sure the stitch direction is flipped. Then we match the stitch and drag the stitch into position between the two notches on the facing. You can pause the video here to complete stitching the facing patterns to the shell. Now we can dress the garment and check for any errors in stitching. This is the best time to check for collisions, which may be caused by wrong stitching, flipped stitches, wrong 3D layer. And also look out for any edges that we have missed out while stitching. Additionally, we can also review the Params tab to review the stitches we have made. We can sort the delta column from the highest to lowest. Here we can identify if the stitches don't match or if the patterns have too much ease. Your simulated jacket should look like this. And we're done. This process of joining the lining to the shell can be complicated, so you can rewatch the lesson and spend some time practicing with the file before moving on to the next lesson. Don't forget to save your files.